Welcome back to MSP Confidential. It's Friday again, and today we have a wonderful guest in Carolyn April, VP of Industry Research at CompTIA. Carolyn, thank you so much for coming to hang out with me for a casual conversation about some of this deep data that you guys do industry research about. Welcome.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I've long wanted to be a guest on MSP Confidential, so I'm looking forward to our chat today.
Well, I appreciate that. It's been kind of an interesting process getting a live stream started and just keeping with the cadence. Finding guests, of course, there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. And it's always great when people that we finally get a chance to ask out say yes, and then we get to have this conversation. So I appreciate you being on the live stream. And you've had an illustrious career with CompTIA, just about 15 years. And I believe earlier this year you stepped into the VP of Industry Research role now. And I was curious to ask you sort of as a bit of an introduction, what it's been like, up leveling this role and what that means in terms of some of your coverage, maybe direct reports and some of the accountability and oversight you have over this industry research stuff, which I know is so deep.
Well, believe it or not, it's the in terms of the additional duties, it's really about me providing more thought leadership out there, doing things like we're doing right now here, spending more time out in front of the public, as opposed to more time in-house managing people. So believe it or not, it wasn't about taking on a lot of direct reports. And it's just kind of an expansion of my role in getting out and about and getting the CompTIA message out, getting the research message out, being a bit of an emissary for the channel, which is one of the things that I've done, during my entire tenure at CompTIA is really worked on that side of the organization. As you know, CompTIA is pretty multifaceted nonprofit, and we do a lot with we have a lot of irons in the fire, put it that way. And one of them happens to be membership and the channel and the vendor community. And I've spent the majority of my time working on that side of the house. And this is just gonna, my new position technically just illuminates that a little bit more.
Hmm. Now, you had your start in journalism, and I see the angle and the connection, the thread that there is, of course, with research and journalism, of course. But I'm curious, sort of what things from the journalism world maybe have come over eloquently into your role as an industry research, titan,
Yeah,
as I'd like to think.
well, I'll forever be a journalist. That was my passion when I went to school. I went to school for journalism and pursued that for, about half of my career before I switched over to being an analyst. And there are a lot of synergies, put it that way. Writing and communicating and analyzing data and situations and kind of trying to distill those for the people that want to read about it and don't want to do the analyzing and the distilling themselves.
Hmm.
Journalists do a lot of that. So they explain to you the who, what, when, where of what's happening in the news. So such and such happened. What does it mean to you, dear reader or dear viewer, whoever it is? And so you spend a lot of time being that person that, that breaks it down for the audience. And similarly, when you're doing research and then trying to explain it to people, not everyone wants to look at that spreadsheet and all those numbers and make sense of it all. And similarly, that's what we do as analysts. The most interesting transition for me, though, from going from journalism to being on the analyst side was it was like role reversal when it came to the media. Because when I was a journalist, I would interview researchers and analysts all the time. I wrote for tech
Hmm.
magazine. So I would be the one calling up the analyst to tell me what write a story about something, new data that came out. And now I'm the one that gets interviewed. And so it's a very strange thing. And so I know all the ins and outs of how the journalism person on the other end of the phone does their job. And they, don't know as much about how I do my job. And it's been an interesting little journey for me. But if journalism's changed a lot, what I did in journalism 20 years ago and plus is a lot different than what journalists today are doing. Media is
Yeah.
very different.
And it's interesting, and I'm probably as guilty about this as the next person. We kind of trade in trends. Obviously, the high, we always are just chasing the highlights, and there are certain things that seem when we see passing by, we kind of latch on to some of those trends and ideas. because whatever part of the journey that we happen to be on, they seem to cause a little bit of extra thinking, and maybe gets you thinking down the path. So back at CompTIA CCF in March in Chicago, CompTIA CCF is the Communities and Councils Forum. Very interesting, sort of multifaceted event because it brings together vendors, it brings together community groups as well as the MSPs or industry people for a very deep conversation. One of the things you did was deliver the State of the Channel presentation, which is a lot of this industry research you guys do on an annual basis into some of the leading trends around the channel, et cetera. And so I thought we'd maybe have a conversation about some of these highlights. And there's a lot of deep data. We maybe will hit the rabbit holes as necessary as we have a conversation about some of these data points. But I was curious to ask you as we sort of kick off the first review, is what kind of process is there to determine what are the things that you want to sort of dig deeper and slice some of the industry research around? Because I imagine you track a lot of information that doesn't necessarily make it into reports or into some of the trend analysis.
Yeah, we definitely have a cutting room floor. Yeah, for things that don't make it. Although, try to do a pretty Herculean job of getting as much of the data in as we can. The State of the Channel is one of our flagship studies, so it's one that we've been doing for a long time. I think this year was the 11th iteration of it. So it's really a tracking study for us. So we do include a fair number of the same questions year over year, so that we have this sort of longitudinal look at how the data pans out year over year. We have plenty of other studies that we do at CompTIA that happen to be one we'll do 1 year and then we won't touch it again for a while. But State of the Channel is not one of those. So we do keep historical data year over year over year. But then every year we wrestle with, well, what new questions are we going to add? And generally speaking, those are based on what some of the things going on in the industry. For instance, there was no getting around adding some AI questions, for instance, to State of the Channel over the last 2 iterations of it. You couldn't ignore that particular topic. So we put those on the study. This year we did a new deep dive into business related questions, very basic business fundamental questions about how MSPs and other channel companies feel about the way they run their business. And I don't mean the technology parts of it, but the real kind of nuts and bolts of their accounting, of how they deal with legal, how they do HR, those sorts of things. Because a lot of times small businesses are struggling in those areas. And we often talk about all kinds of fun technology trends, and we talk about the sort of the trends of the industry itself, but we don't talk about some of the bread and butter things that small businesses are interested in. So we put those questions on this year. We go through a process. I typically will put together an outline with proposal for the study, and we'll disseminate that to both staff that are stakeholders at CompTIA and then to the membership community, and have them take a look at it. There's a 2-week comment process. So people do have input if they think there's something that we're going in the wrong direction completely, or if there is something they really would like to see us drill down on. But we try to make it a wisdom of the crowd sort of thing before we actually go to field with the study. But yeah, if that gives you a little insight into how we percolate these things. So if anyone's interested in contributing to next year's State of the Channel, I'm always open. You can send me suggestions via email.
Yeah, and I think MSPs, in fact, do come across some of these questions internally as they're working. I wonder what my peers are doing with this, and this is the kind of thing that CompTIA likely already has data points on. If it's something obviously emerging or quite new, then those are great suggestions to bring to the CompTIA team on this. But let's get some of these interesting stats here, because I think there's a lot to go through. And let's just see what's here. So some of the interesting things here is just the spend. And I hear a lot of channel leaders or SaaS vendor leaders talking about the increase in the spend. And there's probably more behind the curtain on this number. Expected growth is one thing, but where it's coming from is interesting. I hear a lot that the small business segment in particularly is spending a lot more on technology and growth, business applications, and so on. But maybe walk us through a bit of these highlights here.
Sure, I can do that. Obviously the big number up top is the size of the market. The big takeaway for that and that number comes from Gartner. That's not our number. They do the market sizing every year. But what I will point out from the breakdown on those numbers is this is the first year that the IT services bucket, Gartner kind of breaks down the total IT spend for technology by hardware or infrastructure, I think they call it. So that includes hardware, networking gear, et cetera. Then they do a software bucket. Software is always number one. It has been. And then they have emerging tech and telecom and those sort of things. And IT services is one of their buckets. And that was the expectation. It was the biggest bucket this year and the expectation for the largest growth. Why that's important for our audience is that's the channel. I mean, we are seeing and have been seeing through the last decade or more a very strong shift towards services. And you can define services in many different ways. It's not just one kind. Obviously, there's project related, professional services, managed services. But the channel has moved away from and is moving away from reselling and to the services market. And so the fact that that bucket that Gartner's talking about of money is expanding such just underscores how much the industry is moving in that direction. And that's good news for the smallest MSPs to the largest MSPs. It means it's a lot of money that's trickling downstream for everybody. The other big stat, I won't go through each of these exhaustively, but that's 63% of channel firms that say that they are in better shape than they were 2 years ago. Obviously, that's an optimistic statistic. There is some obvious reason for that, and that we're kind of finally in a post-pandemic, I think, first year of real post-pandemic circumstances. So a lot of companies that were either struggling during the pandemic because their customers weren't spending anymore for all of the reasons that things kind of slowed down during that 2 to 3 year period, or that they were treading water. So they might not have been struggling, but they weren't exactly, growing the business. They were just trying to keep the lights on and keep current customers in the stable. A lot of the channel firms that we talk to now are recovering from that, and that reflects them saying, yeah, we're in better shape than we were 2 years ago. However, there's another reason why a large chunk say they're doing better, and that's because during this time period of the pandemic, they actually did some homework on themselves. They did a deep dive on their own business. They had the time, and they looked at how they could become more efficient, how they could streamline their processes, where they could cut costs, where they could grow revenue. They took the time to kind of play in the sandbox about what some new markets they might explore are. So the companies, the really smart companies, took advantage of that crisis. As we hear in politics sometimes, never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, in a way, some of these companies didn't let a good crisis go to waste, and they took advantage of that time to be able to figure out ways that make their business run better. So I hate to hang it all on the pandemic being over as the reason companies are doing better, but a big part of it is companies are doing better because they did the work during that period of time.
Yeah, and we did see that
I'll take
just
a breath there and let you weigh in before I start rambling on all the other statistics that you got here.
No, you're right, and I think we heard that a ton sort of over the last couple of years, anecdotally. That I think as people sort of pulled back from a lot of their project stuff, clients putting things on hold because of the uncertainty of the pandemic and so on, MSPs kind of looked internally to upskill their teams, to up-level some of their operations and business processes. And I think it was sort of a habit that was very well received in terms of sort of getting it restarted, because I think as we get busy, we tend to sort of let some of those. And when I say we, is because I was an MSP myself for 18 years. And so some of these things I remember quite fondly as like, yeah, I'd like to do more of that, but we're so busy. And a lot of these things tend to also be an interesting function of the size of the MSP. For example, there are just certain investments in upskilling and growth or operational processes that are very difficult to do if you're a sub-7 person firm. You kind of have to, there's a certain inflection point of number of people or a middle management existing in the business that kind of lets you do some of these things. And one of the interesting stats that I think comes up in one of the later slides is this idea that there is sort of pressure on the margin of something like things like subscription revenue. And one of the things that almost never comes out in some of the growth trends is what revenue is being displaced, because it's all not net new growth necessarily, but some things are getting more pressure and starting to shrink, or we're seeing some of the challenges there. So it'll be interesting to talk about that as we move along some of these slides.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it as we get to it, but as certain items do commoditize, MSPs do need to figure out, and this speaks to that services conversation that I had at the beginning, figure out how to make up for that lost revenue or that diminished revenue, I should say, that isn't going to grow anymore, significantly in terms of the margin. So they have to fill that void with something, and a lot of that can be filled with services. One data point that I'll throw out there now is, we asked the channel firms in this study, what is the number one thing? What are the drivers that are going to keep you on this good, healthy path? Those of you who say you're in better shape today. And oddly enough, the number one thing they said was the complexity of technology.
Hmm.
And so complexity usually has the connotation of a negative word, right? That's too hard, that's complex, that's a problem. In this case, because technology is so complex and it continues to grow in complexity, the need for experts is going to increase as well. And who are the experts? Those are the MSPs out there. Those are the channel companies out there. The third parties that have invested in their business that we are technology experts. So as things commoditize, as you said, whether it's subscription sales or something else, moving in the direction of becoming the de facto expert on things, and that's consulting on all various things, is going to be somewhere, if we're talking trends, that the smart and savvy MSPs among us are going to decide to go and really invest in those areas.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's interesting too. I think I hear more conversation about niche specialization, and of course, some of these trends like AI, kind of AI is a niche specialization if you think about it in the context of all the things that MSPs potentially offer to their clients. But I also remember folks like Paul Dipple years ago talking about how there is no significant data to suggest that an MSP that specializes in a particular vertical or niche does any better than one who doesn't, or who is a little bit more general in their approach in nature. But maybe those tides are also changing in terms of some of these trends that are so obviously causing a very thorough effect across the entire channel. It's not just a trend from the consumer and the MSP maybe spinning up a service, but rather like every vendor is now having some kind of impact with AI. Every reseller, every MSP, every customer, and so there's the amount and depth of change in this case is one that we haven't seen in maybe a few years. But the pulse of channel health is an interesting statistic too, because you know, I think people trade also in anecdotal commentary. It's like, oh, it just feels like the economy is terrible, or if inflation is high, suddenly, it feels like that affects everything else. But there are maybe factors that even through inflation, we've talked about IT being one of those things that tends to survive some of the difficult economical times. And so I'm curious about your commentary on the channel health pulse.
Yeah, the channel health, it's definitely, it can be one of those, depending who you talk to, type of questions. And it can be anecdotal, because a lot of times you're spot on when you talk about how people feel about the economy. Sometimes, it's much to the chagrin of people who actually have the numbers. Sometimes it's like, here are the numbers, but it's people, what they feel in their gut is what they're going to tell you, is like, well, I don't feel like it. You can tell me, all day that the economy is doing better than it was 5 years ago, but I'll tell you right now, in my house, it doesn't feel that way. And similarly, that can be when you ask a question like this on a study, how you're feeling. I mean, if you look at the numbers here, they haven't changed that dramatically. Most of the companies that we talk to believe that the channel is both relevant and maintains a level of health that is good. So this is all good news, and we've been asking this question for a long time, and we've not ever seen, a lot of anybody saying, this is it, gloom and doom. And I often point out when I talk in a keynote or any other kind of presentation, that everyone in the audience has sat and listened to pundits tell them that, the channel is on its deathbed. There'll be no need for it soon. Cloud computing is going to eliminate everybody, all of that. Well, so far I haven't seen that happen, right? So I think, the fact that, we have to change, of course, we have to evolve, of course. The fact that we see people reporting on the health of the channel as pretty steady over all those years as indicative of its staying power, which is, a good news for all of us.
Indeed, we heard so much fodder around the death of the desktop, with
Oh
VDI
yeah.
and some of the virtual technologies kind of hitting the mainstream. And I can tell you, with a resounding commitment that the numbers of devices being replaced that we see in some of the ScalePad data with Lifecycle Manager, for example, are completely opposite to some of these, very anecdotal trends that people say, oh yeah, desktops are going away. We're not going to be selling desktops to customers anymore. We have to replace a lot of the maybe margin that we were getting from hardware sales with something else. And but that so far has not proven to be anything but the farthest from the truth. So definitely, I think you got to always, look at these things with a little bit of a grain of salt and not necessarily take
Yeah.
them all as gospel. Indeed. Top priorities in maintaining a relevant and future-oriented IT channel. I thought that was interesting because, like, I hear also lots of conversations around how certain geos are laggards to North America in some ways.
Right.
But then I go out and I spend time with some of our partners in Europe, and I see very forward, cloud practices that maybe some of the North American MSPs have been slow to adopt. But also, like I said before, a bit of a function of the size of business and their ability to actually execute on some of those things. So some of the commentary here from you will be interesting as well.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, the State of the Channel study is one of our three flagship studies of the year, and part of being a flagship study is that we do field this survey internationally to these geos that you're seeing in front of you. And yes, you're right. Often the laggard label does get stuck on in some of the international groups. And what we find is that can be the case in some areas of business, but then in other areas, as you said, like for instance, a cloud practice, some geo is just going crazy. Like telecom, we saw that for years. There was very different adoptions and maturity levels with how companies were using 5G and other kind of mobile type of devices, and that were very different from North America going on in Asia, for instance. So you can't really you can't stereotype. You can't just say this is the way it is in this region and this is the way it is in others. So what we do tend to see is there are often smaller companies, than in North America in some of these regions. That can mean either they have trouble moving quickly and trying new things, or conversely, they are nimble enough because they're so small that they're like, all right, well, we'll try this or we'll try that. So we see experimentation sometimes a little bit more forward in some of those regions. And it's hard to really identify, one region as owning a certain kind of niche
Mhm.
versus another. I tend to see that the North American lead, I suppose, in going places with various new technologies, et cetera, new business models, might be slightly ahead, but it's not quite as big of a disparity as I think we sometimes read about or hear about. And again, it's all anecdotal.
Yeah, I think AI is another interesting topic that sort of creates
Yeah.
questions around some of the geos because, in North America, it feels a little bit more Wild Westy, if I could use a term, than it does in Europe, where it seems like a lot more legislation has come into play to actually curb some of the maybe unknowns of the ethics around AI or some of the things. But also it's interesting how quickly the major vendors like Microsoft or Google have commoditized AI, made it available to everybody inside of a stream that is not necessarily being addressed by legislation at this point. So I find those sort of movements of big trends like this interesting, and it's something we haven't really seen before outside of AI.
It's interesting, and you mentioned regulation and different types of governance that go on, and that can't go unsaid. Those tend to be some of the biggest differences between the regions, is how they look at data privacy and legislate and regulate that, and other types of compliance issues that may come up. So that right there, those you can kind of parse out the very, very different ways that different regions deal with technology, especially in this era of AI, as you said, or
Mhm.
anything to do with data privacy and governance. So those are actual real differences that you can point out.
Yeah, I predict that within the next couple of years, I think we'll see compliance, get a main stage position on some of these trend reports and surveys, just because as the slow drip of legislation is hitting more and more states in the U.S., we're seeing more MSPs sort of really start to care about not only their own internal compliance journey, but delivering this for clients as well. So I think there's a number of those trends driven by legislation, and it's funny that we've anecdotally talked about insurance being the biggest mover of cybersecurity over the last few years. So insurance certainly plays a role here too.
Yeah.
Roadblocks to success. I thought this was super interesting too, because I think, we talked about that little data metric earlier about weakening profit margin and things like subscription sales or the commoditization of these things where, you know, you and I, when we were preparing for this conversation, one of the things I talked about was a bit of the hangover we have from the VAR days of like, you know, if a customer raises their hand needing a service, the MSP or the IT provider or the VAR would go out and say, yep, I can figure out where to buy that from, put a
Yeah.
couple points on it and then just go to market and sell this service. And I think the pressure on these things is increasingly difficult. That margin continues to dwindle. And so it is imperative for MSPs to find services that they can replace some of that lost revenue with. These are obviously impossible to ignore because, you know, if you are selling Microsoft 365 to every single one of your customers, then that's not an insignificant amount of margin by any stretch of the imagination. But I think the amount of work that goes into the delivery of that service starts to create an interesting food for thought in the terms of like, I've seen MSPs start to pivot away from the traditional managed services approach of services being delivered to customers to now maybe doing a dedicated 365 consultancy practice, for example. And so I am starting to see a little bit of a niche focus on delivery of services specifically. And whether or not that comes with the resale of the actual licensing or not is perhaps irrelevant in that case, because they kind of remove themselves from the whole equation of administratively managing a bunch of subscriptions, which is, you know, it requires people. And it's time consuming, of course. But
Yeah,
what are
no,
some of your favorite roadblocks here
yeah.
that you find interesting?
Roadblocks. Okay, well, external factors, that's an obvious one that's going to be at the top. People worry about inflation, people worry about interest rates. People worry about, any kind of global calamity that could arise. There's nothing we can do about that, right? So we can, worry about it, or we can just carry on and try to make our business run and swim successfully and hope for the best. But that's always at the top of the list. The profit margins you mentioned, that's a very real thing. And it's one of the things we actually recommend, is that MSPs do consider things like being sort of the consultative expert around particular buying needs that their customers have, whether it's SaaS, applications like a 365, or it is AI tools that customers might be exploring, and not getting involved in sort of the transactional management of all of that, but really just helping them be kind of figure out what their AI strategy might be. Let's figure out what works best for you. My accounting practice of a customer. How would AI work in your business? We can help you figure that out. We can help map what your needs are that might work with AI to whatever tools happen to be on the market right now. We'll connect you. We'll help manage that over the long haul. But as far as the transaction goes, it's almost giving your customers permission to take their transaction, just the exchange of money for the one thing, the product itself, or the license, whatever it is. Go do that. And then we're going to help you get to the point where you're ready to make that transaction. Then we're going to work with you in perpetuity on the services that are going to be needed in and around that transaction. So that's just one way to kind of fill the gap when and kind of move us out of that VAR hangover existence that some companies have lived in. I love that term. I'm going to use it. I'm stealing it from you for sure. So the third one, their competition from traditional sources, that plays right into what we're talking about. So we're seeing more and more of our respondents every year say, when we ask who are your competitors, and the number one competitor they're saying now are online marketplaces. So like, we're competing with, yes, we still compete with the MSP down the street or another channel firms, but they almost are like, those are our friends in a way. Who we really compete with these days is, the Amazon, the AWSs and the Googles and the Azures of the world, because customers can go there easily, click and buy. And so rather than beat them, they kind of join them, or at least we recommend that they do that. And it's similar, exactly what I just said a minute ago, is if the customers, can easily go purchase something, let them do it, but help them figure out what it is. Winnow that menu of 8 million things that is on the marketplace down to, you think, the 5 that are going to really work for that particular customer's business. They can go buy it on their own, but when then you're in charge of everything that comes after that. You help integrate it, you help implement it, you manage it over the long haul if you're an MSP. That's one strategy to mitigate the presence of the online marketplaces as your competitors, because they're not going away. That's the reality, is there's no way that model is going to be going away anytime soon. So you got to figure out a way to live with it, as opposed and trying to go head to head with their pricing and their delivery model and everything else is just going to be, beating your head against, a wall. It's not going to work.
Hmm.
Um, what else is important on this list? Well, the cybersecurity threat landscape, that's a nightmare for everybody, but it's an opportunity too. Unfortunately, the fact that there continue to be a growing number of data breaches and threats and very creative types of campaigns that bad actors lay out there for us all on an increasing basis that are now trickling down to very small companies. So no one's immune. If you thought ransomware only goes to the big companies with the money, that's not true. The statistics bear that out. So for all of you MSPs who have a lot of small clients out there who think that they don't need insurance and that this can't happen to me, one of the biggest things you can work on is talking them out of that delusion. But that becomes a big challenge for MSPs who have not taken the time to up their game in cybersecurity. So that's why I think this lands on the list of roadblock, because it's going to take a lot of work for some MSPs where cybersecurity was not kind of a big part of their practice or portfolio. It was really just something that, yes, we have AV solutions that we can slap onto this, whatever service we're providing. We do firewall, sure, those sorts of things. But now the level of sophistication that you have to have in cybersecurity, and frankly, that customers are expecting, rises to a new level. You have to have staff that are really cybersecurity experts, and you need to train people. If you don't hire them, you're going to have to train them. You need to understand a breadth of products and services out there that may be way out of the current things that are on your line card. So that becomes both, like I said, it's both a big challenge for a lot of MSPs, but with that challenge comes a great opportunity and a lucrative one if you dive in for real. So I will take a breath there. If you
Yeah,
want
no,
to chat
I,
cyber,
I have a
yes.
couple of comments, and I think one of them is specifically the small business. I don't think they necessarily expect the high level of security. That is definitely also on an interesting spectrum. The larger the end customer business is, I think the more mature they are in what some of their expectations of cybersecurity are for their business. But I think the smaller ones definitely are living in a bit of that delusion. We're not a target, all those things. But at the same time, it's interesting to me that when MSPs are starting to have these conversations, they're actually shifting a bit of the conversation from prevention to defensibility. And I think this is an interesting term. I heard Matt Lee talk about this, Matt Lee from Pax8, who's also very much involved with CompTIA. And I see this more and more and more now, is this conversation around defensibility. And interesting, I think compliance is all about the defensibility of the actions, the decisions, and everything else. And of course, to add pressure to that, I think insurance requires you to have a defensible position so that you don't get sued, or when you get sued by a customer that thought or expected a certain action to be taken, that you were in fact taking the right steps and making the right decisions. In fact, legal even plays a role here, because we've seen people like Brad Gross talk about how even websites that purport to prevent all cybersecurity incidents, those MSPs might get sued for a false advertising claim. Of course, these are things I think again are shifting away from this idea that we can prevent all bad things from happening to, hey, we need to put you in a defensible position for insurance purposes, really. That'll be an interesting trend maybe to dig deeper into for 2025. People moving into this defensibility position as opposed to prevention or.
Yeah, that is very interesting, and we do that. Going back to your way at the beginning here, where you asked me about how we figure out what to put on these studies, cybersecurity and its various permutations. It's always on the study, and that's an interesting angle, I think, for us to pursue the defensibility. I think one of the big hangups with cybersecurity has been the liability issue for MSPs, and they're very worried about that, and decidedly so. And so how you manage that and still be able to present to your customers with confidence that you are a company that is at least has reached a bar of cybersecurity expertise where you feel comfortable. At least you can't promise everything, because nobody is 100% safe, but you feel comfortable putting your services out there that you can back them for the most part. So I agree. That's something definitely to think about for our next go around with State of the Channel.
It's such an afterthought, though. Like, just, as a tangential aside, like the great '80s rock band Great White once penned in a
Oh boy.
song, once bitten, twice shy. I think this is one of those things that I think MSPs kind of, until they get that bite of a potential legal issue, sometimes they don't start to review some of their approach to contracts and agreements and so on. But that's definitely an interesting thing. It's interesting, this 2-year window that you guys have of this. Obviously, from year to year, maybe the data is not significant enough to show the gradual changes. But are you better off than 2 years ago? And I think this is interesting, especially given the tail end of the pandemic, I suppose.
Yeah, this is the first time we asked this specific question phrased this way. So there's nothing to compare it to. But I think if we had asked this question last year or the year before, there would be a big no. It would have, I wish we had it on there, but we're in the middle of the pandemic. We didn't think, maybe I thought it would be too Debbie Downer of a question to put on in the middle of the pandemic, just because I knew that it'd be a lot of negative answers. I was somewhat surprised at the large chunk of respondents who say they are in better shape. I thought, well, this is good. And again, it goes back to what the reasons that I cited earlier. Number one, the pandemic waning and or hopefully, at least from a business environment perspective, we seem to be in a post-pandemic world. I can't speak and won't speak to the healthcare issues that are still going on. Lots of us still get COVID, apparently.
Hmm.
But the conditions for the business environment conditions have improved greatly. But again, I cannot underscore more strongly that when we did a segmentation of the data, the percentage of companies who identified of this 63% who identified as being better off today, who are also following best practices, as you will, who have done some really smart, not easy things to do with their business to improve it during the last 2 years, are the ones that have seen the payoff. So I want to make sure that people don't realize it's not just by luck of the circumstances with the pandemic, but it's also the companies that actually took that opportunity, as we said, to navel gaze a little bit and fix some of the things that might have been wrong with their company, and looked at opportunities to pursue when things got better. And a lot of them hit the ground running. The minute business environment got better, they had actually figured out a roadmap for where they wanted to go next. And there was no delay. They weren't just picking up the pieces. They were ready to just launch immediately, which
Yeah.
was good.
Now, some of the other industry data that we often quote, one of those stats is Service Leadership talks about in Q1 of this year, about 31% of MSPs, lost money. And so that suggests, a much higher percentage here. And you have in this one, 417 respondents, primarily North American. And I'm curious, just as a little data point, what the inflection point of number of respondents is to give you a reasonable cross section of data across the various kinds of MSPs and sizes of MSPs.
Yeah, I mean, the sweet point for a really statistically valid study is to at least have 200 respondents. And we always go for 400 to 500 with all of our studies. So like if you see a study where there's 50 respondents, that data is directional at best. It's not really statistically
Mm.
valid. And the other thing that we do at CompTIA is we do not, our surveys are not out to our membership. This isn't the same database of members being used over and over again. We contract and hire out and pay for sample from professional sample, companies in each of those regions that we talked about. So, the UK sample is been professionally sourced for us. And so that changes, every year you're getting a good mix. So in terms of adhering to market research, we actually adhere to the professional market research standards. There is a standards body for what we do, and we adhere to it. So yes, I guess I'm here to tell you our stats are good. You're all good there.
And by the way, my comment was not to infer anything other than that.
Yeah.
But my point is, I guess there's always data points that are interesting that suggest that there's a different way to look at the data too. Like in the case of
Oh
that
yeah,
service
I mean,
leadership.
we slice and dice too. There's all kinds of ways you can segment this data. So we did, all we're talking MSPs here today, but a lot of the data that we're looking at includes companies that didn't identify as MSP. They identified as solution providers. A lot of the companies in this data are MSPs as well, but there are companies in there that identified as a digital marketing firm. There's a laundry list of channel types. The bulk are identified as either solution provider or MSP or both. We find that a lot of MSPs check a lot of boxes in terms of their business model identification, which tells me, and it has for years, that a lot of MSPs are still very hybrid. They still sell a lot of products. They grew out of the VAR world and morphed into MSPs and haven't fully left their legacy behind. So they can't call themselves 100% MSP because they're not getting 100% or even close to that of their revenue from there. So they live in various spots. Not a bad thing to, they have a hybrid business model. So the data does reflect companies that aren't just in a single lane. So I should definitely say that while we're on our live stream here.
A business model with a hangover, if we continue perpetuate that little trend we were talking about. And it's
Yes.
interesting that VAR service is at the bottom of the list here, of course.
Yes. Now this is a question that we do repeat year over year, and the VAR services has slowly moved toward the bottom, as you would not be surprised. That is becoming less and less of as part of the business offerings and model of today's typical channel company. IT solutions, which is a huge catchphrase for a lot of things, has remained at the top since we started asking, what do you offer in terms of different business services? The rest of the list, I'm trying to see data services, that used to be way down. So that reflects a lot of companies getting it. Data services is where it's at. Data and cybersecurity, and they're related, obviously. Those are two areas that are going to be very hot. AI only makes data services even more consequential and important. And so that as a business line was something that we saw very low on the list maybe 5 years ago, and now it's suddenly creeped up. Consulting services, that used to be pretty low on the list too. Now
Mm.
it's very high. And I think that reflects us moving away from the reseller model and getting much more into consulting with our customers, becoming, it's funny. We used to always say the trusted advisor, and that used to be the kind of the catchphrase for what VARs did. But I think it's really more what today's channel company does. I mean, yeah, the trusted advisor helped you pick out your hardware for your office back in the day, and they'd resell it for you. But what a consultative type channel company does today is so much more complicated
Mm.
and is so much more the true vein of what a consultant is. They're looking at their customer's business and business model and helping them figure out how to apply today's cool technologies to whatever the business outcome that the customer is looking for. That is a degree of expertise and sophistication that I don't think was needed back in the pure reselling days. I'm not disparaging the pure reselling days. I mean, hardware was where it was at, and it's still, we all still need devices. So, and that's not going away, much to your point earlier, where, the death of the PC is not a real thing. But the consulting as such a big piece of a channel business was never at number two, like it is here on today's list.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. And it continues to evolve in the sense that again we talked about this idea of the size of MSP being a conductor to whether some of these things can be executed on successfully or not. And I think the smaller the MSP business, perhaps either the more niche they are on a consultative type of service, or the more reactive they are and unable to actually execute on a consultative service. And as they grow, so those tides change a little bit. So it is interesting to see the dynamics of how this plays out in actual execution. So the cybersecurity piece is, I mean, unrelenting, of course. It continues to be year after year for the last 5, 8 years, the topmost concern and the most in demand thing that MSPs are dealing with, and other firms as well, necessarily MSP centric, but mid market, enterprise, and so on as well.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything that's going to be a surprise here to most people. But I was curious
Yeah,
as you were talking about a moment ago. I wondered if you see data and patterns in your sleep, and what are some of the interesting correlations that maybe have you have found to be a little bit unexpected with some of these in-demand services.
Ooh, that's a good one. Me dreaming data. Wow. I try not to make that be like the predominant thing in my REM headspace at night, but let me think. Correlations. What I think is interesting is that now I will note with this slide in particular is that this is actually from an end user study, or this is MSPs, but they're telling us what their customers are most demanding. So this is what they're hearing from customers. So it's actually a pretty positive thing that they're hearing a lot from customers about cybersecurity. Tells me maybe customers are getting it. Those smaller customers are asking about it. So that's actually progress in that, and moves us away from a lot of those smaller customers thinking that they don't need cybersecurity or they don't talk about it or whatever it happens to be. But I think one of the interesting data kind of things is the mix of the newer things and the staying power of the older things. So we do not see a flip of the switch. And maybe this speaks to how incrementally we move in this industry. It's not sort of a revolutionary churn forward. It's more of a very evolutionary churn progression and how channel companies have evolved over the years. So like there's a foot in the past and there's a foot in the future, and it shows up in these lists and these data. Like when you ask you, what are the most in-demand things? And you see things, like remote network monitoring and management. That's bread and butter. That's our core, correct? Well, that isn't going away, and that's still a very in-demand. Storage and backup. Things like that still are going to have a huge amount of staying power. It proves how important they are too. And yet you'll see layered in all the newfangled things that are slowly building up on that list. AI is on that list. It doesn't look like it's very high up the list, but that's pretty high for only really being on customers' minds for a year and a half, 2 years, really. And that will continue to grow. But what I find is things don't drop off radically fast, but things will enter the fray pretty quickly.
Yeah, interesting. Disaster recovery, like you mentioned a moment ago, along with RMM, along with a number of those things, certainly are in the sort of commoditization bucket. People just expect those things to be handled, whereas before, I remember still from years ago having a conversation with customers about whether or not they wanted a backup service for their very critical data. But I think this speaks to the trend of the end customer valuing their data a lot more than they used to, and I think this is sort of part of the thing that drives a lot of these trends, and part of maybe what some of the delusion around we're not a target, we don't have important data. But now you sit down with any small business customer and they'll tell you that if they don't have access to the data for a couple hours, they're dead in the water and they can't operate, and their business image will suffer. And so I think a lot of the tide around the data, importance of data, is changing for those businesses as well.
Oh, it has. I mean, digital transformation has really it has leveled the playing field in terms of small business versus very large business, and many of the same needs and recognizing the same threats or perils. Maybe that's in protecting the data being one example there, are almost as important to the 10-person company these days as it is to an enterprise company. And a lot of it has to do with digital transformation, everything, e-commerce, everything kind of being online now, and people have become much more aware of how they're not that different, and the way they run their little business is not that different than what some of the priorities and needs are for larger businesses.
Yeah, I found this slide to be really interesting because, the places where people expect to see revenue growth is oftentimes completely disconnected from reality. I find the majority of MSPs I talk to, are in a thick, 10-meter fog. They can't see much farther ahead than next week in some cases. And so it's interesting to see that there is even a conversation about a 2-year window of expected revenue growth in any of these areas. But I think it speaks to how things have been progressing over the last couple of years, which may be, an extrapolation of their sense or their internal, clock of what some of these things are going to do. Probably no big surprises here either. You know, managed services continues to see an increase. A few like the decrease, people expecting to see a decrease in VAR reselling of IT hardware and software is probably the most significant decrease number of this entire list. Um,
Yes. And some of that can be, some of that can be attributed to customers doing much of their infrastructure or hardware purchase needs through online marketplaces,
right.
through those sorts of things. So it may not be that the demand for, like you said, the death of the PC is not really happening. It may not be that the demand for the hardware is gone. I mean, companies still need hardware, but where they get it from is changing. So
Yeah.
they may be doing the purchasing elsewhere. So that's no longer sort of a mainstay for a lot of channel companies and MSPs and bars out there, is they know their customers are getting that infrastructure elsewhere. And so it's no longer a revenue priority for them in terms of what they expect over the next couple of years.
Yeah. Do you guys, as part of your survey respondents, is it primarily channel folks, or do you ever talk to some of the end user companies as part of some of the data as well?
We do. We do have end user studies. We don't do them every year. A couple years ago, I did an SMB tech trends study, which is very interesting. And it was mainly to companies under 250 employees. So very much in the wheelhouse of customers that a lot of MSPs serve, and so it was small customers. So you got a real sense of what their technology priorities were, what the buying trends were among them, who was doing the buying. And so those sort of studies are very they tend to play very well with the channel crowd when I do present them, because it's like, this is what your customers are doing. This is what they think. This is what they're buying. You should be crafting your messaging to this. You should be selling this. And so we do those. They aren't an every year thing. So again, those of you out there who are clamoring for input, to have some input into what we decide to research, that can go on the list. Again, always
Yeah.
useful. Always useful. Yeah.
And I think here's a question that I asked that question because maybe I was leading you to asking this next one, which is I'd love to see, especially in the small business market, which is still by and large, the biggest section or cross section of customer base that the majority of MSPs have. The end user count from anywhere from 25 to 100 people. And I find an interesting trend, even during my time as an MSP, as those businesses grew. Like I remember working with this one business. They started out as a 15-person shop, and over the years, they grew to about 150, 160 people. But the mindset of technology spend did not follow with that growth curve of the business at all. And it's extremely excruciating, I think, in the overall conversations, because you're obviously trying to deliver or scale the capabilities that you have to deliver services to that business. But when their expectations of spend are not necessarily, keeping up to par, it's very difficult. So maybe something to ask those businesses if they are reevaluating a bit of their technology spend needs as their business grows. So
Yeah, this is the big, the need for us to move the thoughts about IT and IT spending that customers might have, thinking about that as a cost center, as opposed to, a tactical cost center, and getting them to think about technology buying as an investment, as strategic to their company, as a way that they're going to make their company run better. They're going to make more money because of the technology investments they make. So the mindset of moving away from IT is a cost center to IT is a moneymaker for us, potentially, because using these types of technology is going to help us run our business better. It's going to help us, whatever, pursue new markets, whatever it happens to be. But that is a mindset change that, you're right. Sometimes a very small company that has a big growth spurt, they stay stuck in small business mentality and they don't really make the move. And that can be very difficult, especially if the small company was sort of a family-run business, and they just have, a lot of times it just has to do with, getting the people to think differently, but often maybe getting different people sometimes.
yeah, and even this ROI or this cost center conversation seems to be shifting. I recall a very particular conversation I had again with Matt Lee. We were in Banff at the Can IT conference that's put on by the folks from Alltech out of Edmonton, and the conversation was basically this: if you're out with the customer, and one of the challenges you're having is getting them to invest in cybersecurity, the change of positioning of like, well, if you what you expect to for IT to deliver is an ROI, consider this. Consider that the percentage of businesses, by Microsoft's data, by any other big vendors' data, percentage of businesses that are being compromised by some security incident is growing and growing every year. So the chances, if you haven't been hit this year, the chances you'll be hit next year are very high. And so if the preparedness, if the discretionary spend on making sure you don't go under in terms of IT spend, because if you have to recover the average, I don't know, $7 million is the average cost of a security incident for the typical small business, that's going to obviously eclipse any kind of original IT spend they had. So if the objective is to get to $0 ROI and not a negative one due to a security incident, you're actually winning. And so it's an interesting sort of inflection of the conversation around the security context of like, well, I don't think ROI is the most important thing anymore. How do we make $10 from this $1 of IT we're spending? It's actually, how do we prevent ourselves from losing, 70 times or 700 times that dollar by not investing in the security. So interesting shift to positioning too.
Very, very much so.
Yeah. Top revenue growth categories by business type. This certainly, speaks to a bit of the focus that MSPs have, whether they're super consultative or they're doing a lot of product resells. And it's interesting, the things that each of those particular focuses or niches tends to predict as the key things. But what was some of the corollary here that you detected?
Well, this set of data bounces off a question that we had on the survey where we asked companies if you were at like a cocktail party or a reception with lay people, non-technology business people, and you're just in your little group having your drink, and you get the general chatter about what you do, and you have to describe what you do in a sentence or so to this person who's asking you, and what would you say? And our choices were, you would describe yourself as we sell technology products. The other answer could have been, we sell services based on technologies, the technology related services. And the last option was, we sell business solutions. We help our company customers run their businesses, and we use technology. We're consultants essentially that use technology as part of what we do. And most people answered in the services middle, which was good. And just below that was in the business solutions answer. The number of total respondents that said that they were product businesses and that's how they would describe themselves was third down. It was the least. So that's a big change.
Mm.
If you would ask that question 5-10 years ago, products would have been the number one thing. But as that relates to this set of data that we're looking at, then we segmented and said, so the people who answered product base, we asked them what they anticipated their top revenue growth categories were going to be. And the product-based people said they were going to see a big increase in managed services. This makes sense. These are the ones who are still stuck in that VAR area, and they are finally making their way out into managed services. So that made a lot of sense to me. People that are already doing a lot of services, and that's how they identified, they are looking at what's hot on the horizon right now, and they're looking at AI and automation and those sort of services that they can bring to their customers today, and they expect to see some growth there. Those who are doing a lot of business consulting, they see cybersecurity as their big cash cow on the horizon, because there's so much that they can do to be working with their customers. It's very specific to their customers' business goals, business protection, and other business solutions to talk about cybersecurity. I just saw balloons floating up in my Zoom. So
Yeah, Zoom probably detected some hand motion. I thought you were celebrating. Yeah.
I know, I was air quoting, and I guess that triggered the balloons. But hey, whatever, balloons are great. It's Friday. What's interesting here, though, is no matter how you identify as a product business, a service business, or a business solution business, all three of them said, what's the area that's going to be declining in revenue for you? And they all said their VAR business, that part of their business. So no surprise there. And as we've gone through all these slides, you can see that's been a theme throughout.
Now, let's talk a bit about this one. I think that we're going to have to jump through, or jump over a few of these, just time wise. But this I thought was interesting, and there's a trend that we talk about how much in the MSP industry there is, accidental business owners, and of course this comes with this territory of business skills that are maybe not there and have to be developed, and somebody that was great at a technical thing but not necessarily great at a business thing, and so I so heavily weighted towards the financial aspect of the business. And there's a later slide that talks about how having a dedicated financial person, a CFO or somebody like that, has been a significant contributor to their growth over the last 2 years. And so definitely seeing a little bit of maturity evolution in the need for financial expertise inside the business. But what are some of the highlights here for you?
Well, this is, I think I talked about this at the beginning, that we added this set of questions about financial fluency, essentially, which is what these are, and how our respondents would rate themselves. Because we get asked a lot at CompTIA from our membership is, do you have any courses or training about, basic business skills? And you're right about the accidental business owner. So, there's, so many really people that get into this because they're really good at technology and they love technology. It's passion for them. And they think, I can hang a shingle, I can do this. And then they get into it and they're like, whoa, I don't really know anything about, how to run this business and run it effectively, whether that's the sales and marketing part of it or the basic financial aspect of it, of which there's many different flavors that are all important. So we asked the question, to rate yourself here. And I was shocked that 38% or so, if I'm reading that correctly, because I don't have my glasses on, but I think it's 38%, said that they're experts. Well, hello. I'm not sure I believe that 38% are experts in all of this, but take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. People like to kind of inflate how they're doing. But I believe that most channel companies sit somewhere in the middle of the road here and would love some additional help from their vendors. If there's any vendors out there and other third parties, they're always looking for assistance to try to assist them. Because what we found is that the companies that pay attention to basic financials and basic business fundamentals 101, whatever you want to call it, are the ones that are growing. They're the ones that are increasing their profit margins. They're the ones that said in our study, we're in a better shape than we were 2 years ago. And that goes to spending some time on this stuff. And if need be, hiring a CFO. They don't have to have that title. If you're a small company, they might just be, the bookkeeper, the manager, whatever it happens to be, but somebody that's dedicated to these functions of a business. Because honestly, you could be great at the technology part of it, but if you are just falling apart, the wheels are falling off in all these other areas, you're going to stay stuck or fail.
And there's one correlation here that I thought was interesting in looking at this data from this slide, but then also looking at or the comment that you made about business 101, and there's a unique, I think, separation between the consumer sentiment of what adequate or moderate financial skills are, and then what the business or enterprise set of considerations or thoughts on that are. And one of those, and I'll jump to the last slide here. One of those is actually this idea of the tolerance for borrowing, investing, or hiring, because again, business 101, if you ask the average consumer, most people don't want to be in debt. Most people think being in debt is a bad thing. In fact, you see a lot of accidental business owners or even, very experienced business owners take a position of like, we're never going to take on any debt. We're going to bootstrap, or we've never had a credit note in our lives, that kind of thing. But we're seeing a lot of success from companies who are learning how to do that successfully, of course, and not all borrowing is bad, of course. And so I find that an interesting correlation that even though you'd consider that a business skill is to learn how to not get in debt, good debt can actually be a driver of growth and expansion.
Absolutely. Not all borrowing is bad. And historically, the channel has been very, very reluctant to borrow or take on debt. And historically, most channel companies stay small. They do not grow. They have these ideas of, they have growth expectations. They want to go from a $1 million business to a 2 to a 5. And it doesn't happen because in part because they are so worried about borrowing money. And, again, there's reckless borrowing. That's not a good idea. And it will always be in that business fundamentals, business 101, not to do it. But companies that are completely unwilling to take a good a good financing risk in terms of credit from a reputable bank or a reputable lender, they're going to stay probably at the same size that they are today, and they're not going to be able to grow. And there are a lot of examples of companies in our world that are perfectly happy to be quote unquote in that sort of lifestyle lane. And I have my dad, for instance, was a small business owner, and he was, very happy to he reached a certain level, and that's where he wanted to stay, and he was cool doing that. But there are so many others that I talked to that are all of these designs on growing. And one of the facts of life is if you want to grow the way that you're talking about to me right now, you might have to borrow some money and just do it in the right way. And that gets back to that financial fluency and making sure you're
Mm.
responsible about it. All of those good things.
Yeah, this number, and we mentioned it earlier, of this big 79% of businesses that are in better shape than 2 years ago for having employed a CFO or equivalent financial or finance professional, I thought was so telling. It's so critical. And some of the most successful MSPs that I talk to from time to time do very much have these folks really much focused and honed in on making that business successful and understanding all the levers and things that need to be pulled. And they're so much more, I guess, top of mind, the things that are changing. Because for the smaller business that only has casual finance looks, once a month I check my P&L type of thing, it's really difficult to make some of the pivots and shifts, and or to even observe the trends. And most IT folks, in terms of business skills, are not necessarily data people. They're not looking for these big trends, but obviously dedicated CFOs or finance professionals are very much looking for the trends. So I find that such a fascinating stat, and I suspect this will continue to improve over the years to come.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I bet that's one that jumps out. There are a number of interesting stats here that jump out among the companies that say they're doing better than they were 2 years ago. And for those who are looking for some guidance and some best practices to maybe mirror, these are some of them. If your owner of a small channel firm, it's just he's a gregarious salesperson, really good at that, knows technology. Let him live in that, his expertise, and,
Yeah.
your company will benefit by not keeping him behind, trying to figure out, like you said, looking over the P&Ls on a regular basis. If you have somebody who's that's their lane and is good at it, everybody wins in that scenario.
So next March, I suppose, is that sort of roughly the timeline for the next version of your State of the Channel report? Is that kind of the timing of your release?
Yeah, believe it or not, we start working on it. I start working on the topics and then the survey development in December. And we usually get the survey written and programmed before we go on holiday leave at the very end of the year. So that'll be in December. So the comment period for that would be in December, believe it or not, for anyone who's interested. And I'll keep in touch with you so that we can, disseminate the outline if need be to anybody in the ScalePad world or anyone out there who's listening who wants to take a look at it before we finalize the survey. So that all happens in December. And then in January, we do data collection. That's usually like 2 to 3 weeks. It's in the field. And then I begin the analysis and writing portion of that. And yes, the goal is then to roll it out. It'll be a finished product for CCF again in March. So our event, that's kind of become the debut location event for the report. But the process starts about 4 months prior. So if anybody wants to get in on the feedback part of it, of the outline, I'm happy to make sure that you understand how to do that and how to reach me.
Well, selfishly, I think I'd love to have you back for a bit of this conversation around these topics, at the next outset, because it'll be interesting not only to, review your data of its, on its own two back legs, but also sort of the commentary and the things that we've been talking about in the context of my mind is always kind of leaning heavily towards the small IT provider and a bit of that world. And so it's interesting to try and put things in that context. Will you be at ChannelCon at the end of the month? I think
I
the
sure
whole comp.
will, yeah.
Yeah, so for
Yeah, I
anybody
will.
who's not aware of ChannelCon, ChannelCon is obviously CompTIA, one of CompTIA's flagship events. Happens in the summer. This year it's in Atlanta. Starts on July 29th and goes through Thursday, August the 1st. If you're a CompTIA member, it's free to attend ChannelCon. It's always a great hang, lots of great sessions, lots of great data and conversations. What are some of the things you look forward to the most at ChannelCon, Carolyn?
Oh, it's been good. Let's see. Our keynote speaker is Kara Swisher this year. So if any of you are fans of Kara, she's going to be speaking on the main stage, I believe on the Wednesday, July 30th, 31st, the last day of July. So that should be good. And she's going to share the stage with our CEO, Todd Thibodeau. They'll have a sort of a Q&A back and forth. Those are always really fun and illuminating. So, but there's lots of other good stuff. I'm on the main stage on the second day of the event doing a power panel with vendors and distributors and MSPs to talk about the evolving relationships between all of these parties. So, and there's been a lot of change in that department. This may not be news to any of you who are listening out there, but the way that everybody relates in this ecosystem, whether it's through partner programs and what those look like today, and communications and other things, we're going to get into a lot of some of the details on that during that power panel. But otherwise, like you said, it's a great hang. There's a big night at the aquarium in Atlanta, which I'm told is amazing. So that's where the party's going to be one night. So if those of you who are always wanting to know what the big party is at these events, we're going to the aquarium. And so in between your drinks and schmoozing with people and fun, you get to look at, all kinds of sea creatures. So that should be interesting as well.
That's awesome. I'm very
Yeah.
much looking forward to it. Now, I sit on one of the advisory councils, the SaaS Ecosystem Advisory Council, and I'm actually moderating a panel this year as well, which should be really interesting. One of the bits of work that the advisory council has been doing over the last couple of years is developing a framework for selecting, reviewing, onboarding, and working with vendors, particularly for MSPs, because there's so much focus on the vendor relationship. And in fact, some of the data we saw on the slides speak to sort of growing and deepening relationships between MSPs and their vendors, of course. So we have John Harden joining that panel. Mary Hamilton of Mad Data and MSP is on the panel. Ryan Burton, who manages the strategic partner onboarding for Pax8, will be on the panel. So I think it'll be a really interesting conversation around everything to do with that entire life cycle of bringing on a vendor onto your MSP operations. So hopefully you can make that. Don't miss it. And Carolyn, thank you so much for hanging out with me for a little bit of time. This is Friday afternoon. I hope I didn't infringe too much on your summer Friday, but I certainly appreciate your time.
No, great time. Great being here. You can have me back. We can chat data again in a year when we've got some new stuff, but hopefully I see you at ChannelCon. Thanks to everybody who joined us today as well.
Yes. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're here every Friday at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern for MSP Confidential. Thank you for joining us again, and we'll see you all next week.